Hello and welcome to my friend the Rainbow Circle. Today I want to talk about Wicked. And if you know anything about me, you know that one thing I talk about obsessively is Wizard of Oz and all the different adaptations. One reason why I love rainbows, even though um, rainbows weren't really in the book series until Polychrome, but anyway, that's beside the point. It seems more odd that it took me nearly 100 episodes to even get around to talking about Wicked. But I think in it's an unusual one for me to talk about. And I don't think most people end up writing a story like Wicked. Um, but I think what's really useful in considering it, especially from my perspective, is to go back to what I talked about before, the Mogan of Relative Values, or whatever you want to call it. It's a system of casuistry designed to really determine the difference between what is actually a universal value uh, in a narrative, what is something that's a common value in a narrative, and something that is entirely a personal value in a narrative. So you really separate it into these three different categories and try to determine honestly and fairly um, any sort of element that you see in a story. What are you identifying as legitimate universal value? What are you identifying as a common value that others can view and say, most of the time, generally speaking, this is something that would work well in a story, what have you, or is something just entirely personal. So, a lot of the times, in my experience, when people try to teach about creative writing, they're mixing up those three categories to a significant degree and really ruining the capacity of any sort of advice they give to actually apply to all stories, and failing to identify them in that way. So, if I were to talk about uh, Wicked, I would have to address all of my mixed feelings about the story, really rooted in some just my very special personal considerations of the story. But anyway, using the Mogon and relative values, it's good to use. It's good to look at things that are popularly considered good, things that are considered just over time masterpieces, things that are popularly considered bad, things that are considered so bad they're good, comparing these things side by side, and looking at how they really reveal elements that you would place in the three different categories on the Mogan of Relative Values. It's really informative about basically how stories work. So just looking at something like Wicked, which is very, very popular, which is what very well loved, among Broadway fans, I'm a massive Broadway fan. I can appreciate and recognize just what's so popular about it. One of the reasons I'm talking about it is because I was supposed to go last week, but it was sold out because it was so very, very popular. I was very excited about going to see it. Even though I have all of these mixed feelings about the story itself, I still love it, with reservation. But yeah, it was sold out just because it continues to be a very, very popular show. Um, so if I identify something about it and I say, this is bad storytelling, for example, if I say this is a problem in the story, where would I put it in the three categories? Would I say this is a problem in the story because it's always a problem in the story? If I say, this is a bad story and frame it in terms of this universal value, and I say, this is a bad story and will always be a bad story, uh, that's dismissing the legitimate and valuable perspective of so many people who love the story. But if I identify something as commonly this would be a bad element, but this particular story overcomes that with some other element, that's much more of a valuable way of reading the story to understand how it works. Or I could definitely identify elements that just personally bother me, but are unlikely to bother anybody else. Uh, but I'm a massive Oz fan. I love all of the books, a little bit too much. Uh, and so a lot of the elements bother me. A lot of elements of the Wicked story bother me on that level. Um, just the nature of the Wicked Witch of the West, for example. I think she's a really fascinating character, and Gregory Maguire's reinterpretation of her, uh, it is so different that I would argue that it's a completely different character. And it's an interesting experiment in taking a well-known character and viewing her from a different perspective, but it's so inconsistent, so just extremely inconsistent with the character in the book that it's, I would argue, much better just to view her as a completely different character. The character in the book is a fascinating character, and I really wish somebody would take what she's actually like in the book, and write a story about her. Just really fascinating. And I teach a class on Wizard of Oz, so we talk a lot about things like Mad Woman in the Attic. Certainly from a feminist perspective, you could certainly view her analytically, from a scholarly perspective, you could view her as this manifestation of that Mad Woman in the Attic sort of concept of powerful women being treated as evil. Um, and it's fascinating. I mean, this gets into a lot of the nitpicky stuff I'm really fascinated by, just on an entirely personal level. It's fascinating to look at L. Frank Baum, who was highly influenced by his feminist mother-in-law, and say, why is he creating this evil witch, despite being heavily influenced on a very positive way, by his mother-in-law, Matilda Gage, very important figure in the first wave feminism. Um, and he claimed that he supported feminism, but then he writes this witch who's evil. Um, and his mother-in-law even wrote a book called Women, Church, and State. Women, Church, and State, which really predicted a lot of the stuff that Gilbert and Goubar say in Mad Women in the Attic. Just the idea that strong women tend to be depicted as witches, as a way of reducing their power. All that stuff is really fascinating. But as a writer, even if I looked at it if I took on the same task as Gregory Maguire and I said, the Wicked Witch of the West is an interesting character, let me write the story from her perspective, the story that I write would not be wicked. It would be because the Wicked Witch of the West is this very, very old character who has very little power. Um, and in many ways, she's just like the wizard. The wizard has no power and he pretends like he has power. The Wicked Witch of the West has no power. She pretends like she has power. That's a really fascinating story of this homeostasis in this land based on the false perception that the other person has as much power or more power. Fascinating story. And just in the book, she's afraid of everything. I mean, that makes her a really interesting character, if you ask me. She's a really weak character. She's terrified by Dorothy. Um, Dorothy, of course, is one of my favorite characters, a very fascinating character in and of herself. But, um, how did she get to this place where she's just this weak, powerless old woman? So partly just as a writer, that the character that I write would be quite different. So, and that's, if you look on the Mogan of Relative Value, that's not a fault of Gregory Maguire for writing the character that way. And I read the book so long ago that I forget all the details, and I know the Broadway play a lot better, much 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 better. There's so many details I forgot from the book, and I know the Broadway Wicked is a lot different from the book Wicked. But then you get to, just if you treat Elphaba just as a character, just as a separate character, I mean, that's an entirely personal thing. I mean, there's so many changes from the book that just on an entirely personal level just bother me, and I think undermine the story in many ways. But I think will that appeal to people who aren't in love with the books? And, I can dismiss that as just an entirely personal thing. But looking at moving it into the middle section of the Mogan of Relative Values, are there common sort of story faults that you would look at? And I think a great way to look at that, the song that I'm most obsessed with, of course, is Defying Gravity. All the songs are great in Wicked, if you ask me. If you look at the three most significant, arguably most significant adaptations of Oz. The 39 version, uh, The Wiz. My personal favorite is The Wiz, by the way. Um, I love the magic of the 39, but so much of it is different from the book that it bothers me in a very different way than Wicked does. Um, but The Wiz is, arguably the best one. Um, and Wicked, if you look at those three, and you just look at it in terms of music, The Wiz, again, has the best soundtrack, top to bottom. Easily the best soundtrack, top to bottom. Um, but Wicked has the best individual songs, I would say, like Defying Gravity, as much as I passionately love all the songs from The Wiz, Defying Gravity is such a great song. Um, but lots of the songs from Wicked are just amazing. But if you look at the role Defying Gravity plays in just the sequence of the story, and you say, what role does that play in telling the story, for example? I mean, just as an individual song, it's amazing. Uh, but the place it has in telling the story, it comes right before the shift from Act One to Act Two, and that's just traditionally a really significant place in the story in a Broadway show. That's the curtain closer number. Um, you know, it has a very particular function, and if you look at the Rainbow Circle, it has a very particular schematic function. Uh, it's designed to uh, make the audience so interested in what's going to happen next in the story that they stick around. So it's a hook to keep the audience invested, so that when they go into uh, intermission, they come back as excited as they were before intermission. So it's a very tight schematic function, and I think that's just in considering um, universal values in a story. The particular schema, that's more of a common value, but the way schema works within a story functions more effectively as a universal value. It sets up an expectation, and it fulfills that expectation, therefore heightening stimulation or affecting stimulation in some way. So the curtain closer, the song right at the end of Act One, has that very particular schematic story function where there's a goal, make the audience excited enough where they're still excited when they come back from intermission, and so you can assess it schematically and say how effective is that particular song in doing that. And usually, some of the best songs will be the end of Act One. Some of the most famous and significant songs will be at the end of Act One because they have that very particular function. And usually the song at the end of the whole show will be, usually it's some kind of reprise of previous songs. Sometimes it's just a collage of a bunch of songs. Usually the big climactic number will just be a callback to all of the songs. Not always, of course, but usually it'll be just mixing and matching different songs from before. Um, uh, Wicked. The climactic song is probably For Good, but For Good is a great song, but it's a much more low key sort of song. I mean, there are a couple of songs right after that, but it's much more low key sort of a song. No Good Deed Goes Unpunished is probably the story climax song. But there's a long tradition of that song right at the end of Act One and just how it functions. Like my favorite example by far is Everything's Coming Up Roses in terms of story function, and just the perfectly constructed. I mean, Gypsy in many ways is just a perfectly constructed story, but the perfectly constructed first act closing number is Everything's Coming Up Roses, because the story in Act One is that Mama Rose just keeps trying and trying and trying and trying to get her children's act to succeed, and just driving everyone crazy and being just super monomaniacal and uh, driving people away. And she drives baby June away, and she shifts her focus to Louise. And so everything's coming up roses is this superficially optimistic song uh, that, knowing Mama Rose, you know that she's going to do the same thing she did to baby June, to Louise. And she's going to destroy her if she can't. Either drive her away or destroy her in her pursuit of success for her children on the stage. So it's such an upbeat song, and if you listen to it, and I listen to it over and over again, of course, if you listen to it, it's the disconnection of the verses makes it sound just like the rantings of just someone who's been driven completely crazy by failure, who's convincing herself that everything's going to be okay, although clearly it is not. So it's just perfectly designed. With Louise, this character that we've grown to love, you just fear that she's going to be destroyed completely. Turns out that she becomes Gypsy Rose Lee, and she's fine. And then you have the perfect reprise number, which is Rose's Turn. Rose's Turn is really my favorite of all the reprise numbers ever. Just a perfect sort of matching of two songs. But you have that layered sort of paradoxical motivation where you want everyone to succeed, but you also fear for their safety at the same time. So you go to intermission with that song, and you have to see, is she going to destroy Louise's life, or drive her away? But yeah, I mean, so many, like in Dreamgirls, the close of Act 1 is You're Gonna Love Me, and Effie has similarly driven everyone away. They're kicking her out of the Dreamgirls, and she sings this intensely super visceral song of rage and need and love, and one of the best ever. And then Les Mis, it's One Day More. I mean, One Day More is much more of a straightforward sort of a song, but you have it's a great climactic first act song where you have these hopeless people who are aiming to take back their rights, but it's the miserables, so it's gonna go badly because everything in that play goes really badly for everyone. And so, but it sets it up perfectly for your interest in Act Two. The Wiz ends with what would I do if I could feel, which I love that song, but it doesn't quite work that way, the same as the really great ones. Funny Girl has Don't Rain on My Parade, just a perfect example of a for Act 1 climax song. She's gonna stay with Mr. Arnstein. We love Fanny. We don't want her to get hurt, but she's gonna stay with Mr. Arnstein, and nobody's gonna tell her otherwise. But I mean, arguably, this is where it goes into the middle section of the Mogan of Relative Values, because arguably, what first act climax song should do is establish the internal conflict of the character to the degree that you're both excited about what's going to happen next and worried for their safety. So they have this internal conflict. Mama Rose is always going to be this predatory figure with her kids, and just wreck their lives or push them away. And that's her internal conflict. She could just leave them alone. She has a choice to do the right thing, and she could just leave them alone. Or she can just keep on with her path of destruction. Fanny has the choice between leaving Mr. Arnstein and pursuing her career, or ruining her career by going after the love of her life, which we all can see is a bad idea. Um, it's uh, don't keep going down that path. I mean, it's that classic horror movie thing where somebody investigates the noise, and we know for sure that they're going to get chopped to pieces. I mean, that goes back to Aristotle. I disagree with so much Aristotle says, um, but that's the middle section of the Mogan of Relative Values. That's a common sort of value in storytelling. Just commonly, not universally, but commonly, that's a really potent sort of emotion to elicit in somebody. Something rooted in the character. The character's on a destructive path, and you worry about their safety. It's that Oedipus is going to, through his hubris, is going to destroy his own life. Not necessarily an external conflict, but it's through his own internal faults. In the setup of Defying Gravity, just right before the song, Glinda says, "I hope you're happy." And Glinda, I mean, I can go on and on about how Wicked does a massive disservice to Glinda as a character. Glinda is such an amazing and powerful and complicated character in the Oz series. Um, that's something that always really bothered me a lot about Wicked, is how they turned Glinda into Galinda. But Glinda tells Elphaba that she shouldn't have gotten mad at the wizard. The wizard has this horrible scheme where he's turning flying monkeys into spies, and he's enslaving the talking animals and stuff like that. And Elphaba gets angry at him, and Glinda says, "You shouldn't have gotten angry at him." But uh, but she should have. I think, and that's a problem, and that's not a universal problem. That's the middle section where a common sort of narrative problem is Elphaba's so obviously right in her anger against the wizard that it reduces the complexity of our emotional responses. So she doesn't really have a choice but to defy him. The ironic thing about Elphaba, arguably, is that she isn't wicked at all. She's entirely justified in what she does. And I always really want her to do something that could be considered wrong. Maybe that's just my personal values. It might be more common sort of narrative values. But in order for her to be really justified as wicked, she never really does anything that's wicked. She fights against someone who is obviously bad. And there's really no justification for what the wizard does. The wizard treats animals as animals, but he's so cruel in doing it. It's a hard thing to really defend. I met a Marable and, all of the different villains. There are people all around, and so I don't want them to think I'm weird. So I keep pausing it. I guess I didn't learn from Elphaba just to embrace my weirdness and not worry about what other people think. But anyway. So, and that kind of makes Glinda a far more interestingly wicked character. I know that's one of the basic ironies of the story, is that Glinda had some awful qualities in and of herself, but by capitulating to the wizard, the obviously evil wizard, by capitulating to his obviously horrible concepts, she does something that's far more wicked. But what does Elphaba ever do that's really wicked? And if she had done, I think that would have made her a much more interesting character. if she had done something that someone could consider wicked, um, then I think that would make the emotional response far more complicated. Whereas um, she has this rallying cry of defying gravity, but why wouldn't she defy gravity? I mean, not coincidentally. Ironically, it's it it's a rallying cry to embrace her agency, while at the same time, ironically, what sort of agency does she really have if she makes the really obvious moral choice that no sane and decent person would fail to make, arguably? And Glinda, by making the wrong choice, becomes more of an interesting character, who by the end becomes far more interesting because she spent this time capitulating to, the evil ways of the wizard. So, great. Just isolated, it's a magnificent rallying cry. Just as a song, it's a magnificent rallying cry of defying false authorities. Fantastic sort of anthem. But compare that to the Wiz, of course, the superior one, to all of them. When Dorothy's facing the Wicked Witch of the West, in that version, Eveline or Evermean, I get them mixed up. I think the Wicked Witch of the West I say it's like my favorite movie, but I get characters mixed up, of course. But Eveline is this horrible factory boss who's going to murder Dorothy's friends. Dorothy is a decent person with good moral values, but what choice does she have but to kill? And killing is wrong. Dorothy believes killing is wrong, but she's faced with this choice: do this really horrible thing or let this other horrible thing happen. So her choices are wicked, arguably. Far more wicked than anything Elphaba does. Elphaba accidentally does some bad things, but that makes Dorothy a far more fascinating and complicated character with far more agency, also far more defiance of convention and all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, I mean, that's kind of how the Mogan of Relative Values works, because I can recognize that commonly these would be story problems. Giving a character a conflict that with such an obvious solution that it undermines just the emotional impact of their choices. Common sort of narrative problem. But I would not call that a universal narrative problem, because it still succeeds. It's still very popular, still very beloved. And I think it succeeds on a much more base level issue. It's much more of an irrational sort of a level, where if you listen to Defying Gravity, you have to rally behind it just because it's so uplifting on an irrational level. The music is rousing. The characters are rousing in so many ways that, if you don't overthink the moral situation and how easy her choice actually is, it convinces you that it's a difficult choice. If you don't overthink it too much, it convinces you that it's a difficult choice. But yeah, on that really basic, visceral level, Elphaba is a delightful character and a fascinating character. Even if you can point to story flaws, it succeeds just because it taps into that something much more essentially visceral and irrational that is harder to explain. Whereas I can point out the narrative flaws. This is sort of what I was saying with The Lion King. A lot of people will present these false universals of how a story should work, but ask those same people, is Lion King a good story? They'll say, yeah, Lion King's a good story. Lion King's not a good story. all based on those values. It fails on pretty much any of those middle section Mogan of Relative Values things. Most common sort of um, issues that you have with stories, Lion King is a failure on pretty much all of them. Um, that doesn't mean it's a bad story, because it succeeds. It's very popular, it's well loved, and that proves that it's not actually a flawed story. But how does it succeed? Well, it's beautiful, it's viscerally resonant, the songs are great, the characters are really compelling, all that stuff succeeds. And I think that's a lot of what's going on with Wicked. I mean, a lot of it is much more of an irrational level, visceral sort of stimulation where it succeeds. Harder to really universalize and turn into a set of rules. And so that's why I would say understanding the mechanisms of stories, understanding where to really place any sort of recognition of what you find appealing about a story, a lot of it is just much more on a purely irrational level, where it's much more effective than learning rules. It's much more effective to train your subconscious to take out how something really works. I mean, so if you look at something like Wicked and you say Wicked works really well, and you try to determine the reasons it works well, you can identify a lot of things that might be entirely personal, get a greater understanding of your own personal values when it comes to aesthetics, but ultimately identifying what aspect of the story works well, it goes beyond just something that you can explain or have any real need to explain. It has to do with, a lot of the subconscious forces. But that might be all we have for today for my Broadway hour. And I will see you on the next episode. Where I might talk about Broadway again, because why not? One of my favorite things to talk about. See you on the next episode.